Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ambassador's Lounge. As you all know, in September this year, Mr. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, in his address in the Parliament, accused India of assassinating one of its citizens, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, accused India of killing Hardeep Singh Nijjar on the Canadian soil. India dismissed these allegations as absurd, but 2 months later, the American agencies accused India of plotting to assassinate Mr. Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, again a Sikh national and a close friend of Mr. Hardeep Singh. India dismissed again this allegation, but said that it was concerned about these allegations and promised to set up a committee to inquire into it. Now, these incidents, they are not new. In 2021, there was Prameet Singh Panjwar, again a Sikh national, who was assassinated in Lahore. Pakistan then brought it to the attention of the international community, but nothing much transpired. Now, why is India indulging in these activities? Is India asserting itself? This is the question which we need to look into, and we have with us today Mr. Adam Weinstein. Adam, welcome to the Ambassador's Lounge.
Thanks for having me.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Weinstein is a Deputy Director of the Middle East Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He previously worked for KPMG's international trade practice. Adam's current research focuses on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He also has led research projects on Iraq and Turkey. He is an attorney and admitted to the New York bar. Adam has also served as a US Marine and deployed to Afghanistan in 2012. Adam, let me begin this talk. My question to you is, now this Khalistan movement, it was very high in the 80s and the 90s. But after 86, after the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, it fizzled out. But now we see a new hype in this anti-Sikh sentiments in New Delhi. What do you ascribe it to that?
Well, look, I'm not an expert in the movement itself, but insofar as the insecurity that seems to exist in New Delhi, I think, you know, it's a natural consequence of the kind of strongman, majoritarian, populist politics we see under Modi and the BJP. And we can debate whether it's a result of India trying to assert itself or it's a feeling of insecurity within India. But the fact is, India's engaging in these plots because they can. Now, I would argue that it's short-sighted. They're wasting an incredible amount of political capital, and they're actually lessening or reducing their own prestige and the prestige of their intelligence services, I might add, because the operation in Canada was quite sloppy, and obviously the alleged operation, attempted operation in the US also was sloppy enough that it was intercepted. And so I think they're giving up some of the prestige that existed around their intelligence services to really pursue individuals who simply aren't capable of threatening the Indian state. So you have to wonder why. But it may make sense to them.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also joined in this discussion by Ambassador Riaz Bukhari and Ambassador Tanveer Khaskhali. Riaz, your question?
Yeah, thank you, Imran. Adam, as we are discussing, the Sikh problem or issue as being reported by the media, You may recall that in elections were held in India in 2019. At that time, Pakistan threat was used by the BJP to win votes, domestically. False flag operations were conducted within India, blaming Pakistan. Now elections are due in India next year. Do you see Sikh threat as another ploy to use domestically by the BJP to win elections?
Well, I'd say that it's not necessarily the Sikh threat on its own. Of course, again, I'd argue that none of these individuals living in the diaspora are truly a threat to the security of the Indian state at any real level, even if they themselves aspire to be. They're simply not, I don't think the capacity is there. Granted, I'm not an expert on the movement itself, but I just don't think the capacity is there. But I think what you see in India is India engaging in this kind of behavior, and then there's a negative reaction from Canada or the United States, and then you see Indian nationalists saying something along the lines of, oh, well, look at the kinds of behavior the West engages in, how dare they call us out on this, and kind of playing the victim card in that sense, and that arouses nationalist sentiments. So it's not just the alleged threat from the Sikh diaspora itself, it's the fact that the West dares to criticize India for attempting to carry out these operations, or in the case of Canada, successfully carrying out an assassination. And I think that can be useful for the BJP, in an election season.
Well, Adam, I'll be continuing the same discussion. I think I'd like to ask that when Pakistan brought the attention of the world to India's transnational terror program, world thought Pakistan was paranoid. Today, the truth is coming out. India's network of extraterritorial killing has gone global. Your views, you have mentioned something, but we just wanted to have your views on that.
Well, different states around the world engage in proxy warfare and have their non-state actors that they back, and of course it's no secret that India is engaged in that behavior as well. Pakistan's also engaged in that kind of behavior, although I think that's more widely understood in the West than perhaps the kind of behavior India engages in. And I think it's probably without a doubt that India's had some involvement in Baluchistan, although I don't think India is the driver of that conflict. I think the underlying drivers are within Pakistan, but when those conditions exist, an outside actor like India, of course, can take advantage of it. And in the case of why didn't the world, to answer the question, why didn't the world take it seriously when Pakistan found a plot against a Sikh individual inside Pakistan? I think it's because anytime Pakistan or India accuses the other of nefarious activities, there's a little bit of skepticism from the international community because, of course, the relationship between India and Pakistan is so negative, and both countries are constantly accusing the other of various activities, and some of those accusations are true and some of them aren't. I do think historically, the international community has taken India's accusations more seriously than Pakistan's, and I think that's because, there's various reasons. I think India has more soft power, India has a larger diaspora, it's much more common for someone from the rest of the world to have visited India and have positive feelings about India than Pakistan, and for various reasons that we could spend the next hour talking about, Pakistan has often been associated with terrorism. Nevertheless, I do think the Indian government is losing the plot a little bit on its own narrative because, of course, when you engage in this sort of hyper-nationalist, paranoid rhetoric that we see coming out of the BJP's India, it's no longer convincing to anyone outside of that bubble. So I think India's narrative is becoming weaker as well, and that's a totally self-inflicted wound on the part of New Delhi.
Adam, you said India is it's a inflicted wound. Now, U.S. has spent time, energy, and resources on cultivating India, on cultivating Indian leadership. It's been going on for long now. U.S. presidents have been visiting regularly the U.S. Now, with this new, this rogue behavior of India, do you think it will cast a negative shadow on India-U.S. relations?
You know, I really don't think so, actually. I think that there's strategic reasons for the U.S.-India relationship that are more important than India's recent behavior, and for a few reasons. And first of all, I think any U.S. citizen should be incredibly offended and upset that any foreign government attempts to assassinate someone on U.S. soil. That's completely unacceptable, and I understand Canada's outrage at that. But if you look at the Canadian response and you compare it to the U.S. response, it's two very different responses. Canada responded and Trudeau responded in a very personal way. Trudeau made it political from the onset of the crisis. And I don't know that worked out too well from Canada's perspective. The way the United States has responded to this has been through the courts. This is a matter of rule of law. If you look at how it was announced, it wasn't announced by President Biden. It was announced by the U.S. legal system. And so they're making this a matter of rule of law and respect for sovereignty. They're not making it a matter of respect for the U.S.-India relationship itself, which is how Trudeau framed it, and things escalated quickly, and India threw around its weight, and it can throw around its weight because it's so much bigger than Canada. It's a little bit different with the U.S.-India relationship. Look, the U.S.-India relationship is in one sense based on strong people-to-people ties. There's an incredibly large Indian diaspora in the United States. There's many Indians studying in the United States. Indians are overrepresented in the tech industry, and there's a large naturalized Indian community, and there's also a multi-generational Indian diaspora that has been in the United States for generations, living as Indian Americans. So that part of the relationship exists, but there's also a strategic relationship. There's the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I'm sure we're going to get into that later, but that's based on this notion of containing China. And at least for the current administration and for the foreign policy establishment in Washington, that goal is more important than any of these other things.
So you mean to say that this thing is going to fizzle out with the passage of
I
time?
think it will fizzle out. I could be wrong. I think it will fizzle out. I don't necessarily think it should fizzle out. I think it's we've opened a Pandora's box in a way in which now, because it fizzles out, other countries are going to feel emboldened to assassinate individuals on U.S. soil, and I think that's a very dangerous precedent to start.
Yeah. Adam, now let's discuss, Indian response to war in Ukraine. New Delhi's policy of strategic autonomy or non-alignment was on display during war in Ukraine. It was reluctant to fully embrace U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific as well as on the Ukraine. In fact, someone described it as mismatched, expectations from both sides. Does you have any other option in South Asia?
Well, we have the option of not seeking a confrontation with China. I mean, I would argue that there's a certain amount of healthy competition between the United States and China that can benefit the world if we're competing in green energy, or if we're competing in infrastructure, if we're competing in developing certain types of technology, that can have a benefit. And Xi Jinping's visit to the United States, I think, was a necessary off-ramp in escalating tensions. We'll see how long that lasts. So I think the U.S. has the option of approaching China, not approaching China in a zero-sum way, and recognizing that in some sense, trying to contain China is a fool's errand. We can compete with China, but trying to contain China, and certainly any fantasy about having a Cold War with China in which we come out on top in the long run, I think that's counterproductive. I think there are areas in which the United States has to compete with China, but we should avoid viewing that relationship in a confrontational way, because it simply wouldn't be good for humanity. But I think the foreign policy establishment in the United States is concerned about a confrontation with China. It views India as a natural partner. It views India as a natural partner that can contain China. And I think it's a strategic, narrow, limited relationship in that sense. I mean, there are folks in Washington who I think were truly surprised by the way India approached the conflict in Ukraine, and they were actually personally hurt by that. I don't understand why, because anybody who's read history will know that India is strategically autonomous in many ways, and of course was part of the non-aligned movement and so forth. So that's not surprising to me that India will chart its own course. India will do what's good for India. The Indo-Pacific strategy for now seems to make sense for India, and so that's why India is part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. We can use flowery language in Washington and rhetoric about shared values and democracy and this and that, and yes, it's true, India is a democracy. It's a very illiberal democracy, but it is a democracy. But at the same time, I don't think the relationship is based on shared values, and certainly not under the BJP's India. It's not about shared values. It's about a narrow set of strategic interests that some folks in New Delhi and Washington think are aligned.
So do you agree it is a mismatched expectation relationship?
I think there are people in Washington, D.C. that are part of the foreign policy establishment who have expectations of India that are greater than what India intends to fulfill. I'd put it that way.
So, do you think India is a dependable partner from that point of view? If it's
Well, I think it's dependable if you step back and you say, well, what's in it for India and what are India's interests? The problem in Washington, D.C. is that I think and this is true for many countries, but I'm speaking about mine right now, and I think the foreign policy establishment in Washington has a very difficult time putting itself in the shoes of other countries and having this kind of understanding of what their interests are. And it's almost an assumption that the interests of our partners should be neatly aligned with our interests, when that's just not the case. And we're sitting in Pakistan, and there perhaps is no better example of having a history of misaligned expectations and misaligned interests in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And that's simply because we failed to step back and say, okay, here's where our interests align, and here's where they don't align. And sometimes there's a gap in perceived interests that simply can't be overcome, and that's okay. It's possible to work together on certain areas of common interests while acknowledging there are other areas where we're not going to see eye to eye.
Just staying on the same point, how important is U.S.-India relationship from Indian point of view?
Well, I think it's important for India economically, and I think India is also genuinely concerned about the rise of China. So I think it is important. But of course, India is going to do what's right for India, and I don't think anyone in Washington who has the expectation that India is simply going to fall in line with what Washington wants simply because it's part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think they're going to be disappointed.
So then this Indo-Pacific strategy, is it based on realistic analysis, or it's just idealism?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy could probably, and of course, I'm not an expert on the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think the Indo-Pacific strategy could prove effective in containing China in some ways, perhaps in terms of certain military capability, net military capabilities and things of that nature. But so far as the Indo-Pacific strategy being based on this idea that the world can contain the rise of China, I think that's fundamentally flawed.
Continuing same, before I ask my question, you're talking of the institutions, the foreign policy making institutions. Are they in a sense that can't they be overruled by the politicians or the Congress in certain cases if they think that whatever they are presenting is not in the interest of USA? Can it be done, or the process is laid down that you follow that path, and as presented by the institution or whosoever makes the policy, that has to be taken to the end?
Well, in the US system today, as it exists today, the president has expansive powers when it comes to foreign policy, and especially when it comes to defense policy. And of course, much of that policy is crafted in the National Security Council, and the State Department has its own ideas, but largely, the State Department carries out foreign policy and is less involved in crafting it. I think that's how it works. But Congress does have an oversight role, and Congress also can craft foreign policy initiatives through legislation. But I think the mood in Congress is quite hawkish when it comes to China. So yes, it's true, Congress can find ways to override, but will it in this case? I don't think so. I think they're on the same page. In fact, I think the containment of China there's a bipartisan consensus about that.
Let me answer that. U.S. past endeavors in South Asia have either remained unconclusive or failed, with a new policy of offshore balancing in form of multilateral arrangements which are more military in nature. How do you see the regional scenarios developing?
I think vis-a-vis China?
Overall?
Well, in the case of China, since that's what we've been talking about, I think there's countries that are very concerned about China and their own sovereignty, and the Philippines is one I can think of in which I think China has engaged in some provocative behavior that the Philippines is rightfully concerned about. Of course, Taiwan is the obvious answer to that, Vietnam. But I think those countries, they're concerned about China. They want to have a partnership with the United States, but at the same time, they still need to have a functioning relationship with China, and they certainly don't want to be asked to choose sides. And they're going to align with the United States when it benefits them, and they're going to perhaps deviate from what the U.S. wants them to do when it benefits them as well. So I think there's definitely concern in the region over China, but I don't think it rises to the level in which you're going to see countries picking camps and so forth.
But Adam, continuing with the question Tanveer asked, these multilateral alliances, Quad, AUKUS, and now you have this Sydney dialogue, something to that effect. They are more military in nature. Security-wise, the security aspect is strong. Do you think they will really contribute to peace in the region? I mean, they're more offensive in spirit.
Well, look, that remains to be seen. I do agree that they're military in nature, and they are escalatory in a sense, by definition. If you're China and you see the United States engaging in, creating these multilateral defense pacts in your backyard, in a sense, that's an escalation, and I can understand that from the Chinese perspective. At the same time, I'm not sure that these countries would necessarily be so quick to enter these pacts if they didn't also feel that their sovereignty was threatened by certain Chinese actions. So I actually think both China and the United States are escalating things with one another.
I mean, the focal countries of Indo-Pacific strategy, they've all increased, almost doubled their defense expenditure. Look at South Korea, look at Japan, India, Australia. So whatever they are doing, it's not to attain peace in the region or to promote peace in the region. It's more that they are getting ready for a fight.
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends on.
See, China has never been intrusive. China has never occupied a country. China has never been aggressive.
Well, I think China has a different strategy than this sort of direct military intervention for getting its way in the region. Look, some people would say that the best, to put this in a really blunt sports-like terminology, the best defense is a strong offense. I mean, to have this sort of to have the capacity, I think, can be a deterrent. And some folks might argue that by increasing their military budgets, they're deterring China from behaving in a certain way, and that's going to have a net peace dividend in the end. I do agree with your skepticism. I do think having an arms race in the region or rapidly building up various defense, national defense budgets, could backfire in a way. I think it remains to be seen. But I think the real risk is when you have these defense pacts, these multilateral agreements, you have this buildup in military budgets. And by the way, again, I'm not a China expert, but China's rapidly modernizing its navy, so it's certainly preparing for a fight as well.
So is Australia. You are providing them nuclear-armed
well, fair enough.
submarines.
But China's navy scale matters when it comes to naval warfare. So I think
See,
China.
if this is a fact, then why aggravate the situation? Why instigate China? Why does Australia need a nuclear-armed submarine? Isn't it a violation of NPT by any way?
Well, look, you're preaching to the choir about not putting nuclear weapons in overdrive, but I think what's most important is that these military these military developments not exist in a vacuum. There has to be diplomacy at the same time. I think that's what's most important. There have to be diplomatic initiatives that are happening at the same time.
Adam, coming back to again the US Indo-Pacific strategy, it gives India a central role in South Asia. US is propping up India militarily, supporting its aspirations like membership of the UN Security Council. PM Modi's visit to Washington this year, it outlines huge number of MOUs and agreements, and choosing India for the most modern, sophisticated technology, but turning blind eye to its human rights violations, as pointed out by former President Obama. Do you see, the Indian treatment of minorities and other, issues, pending issues? In this scenario, what role exactly US see for India in the foreseeable future?
In terms of human rights?
Not even human rights, but the UN Security Council aspirations, expanded role over there.
And the region.
Well, I mean, look, on the same token, we can say, well, Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council itself has flaws. Let's just put it that way. But there's no doubt that India is violating the civil liberties and human rights of its minority communities. I mean, I follow this closely.
Yeah.
The lynchings that occur on a regular basis, the communal violence that occurs regularly, the lack of internet in Kashmir, the restrictions that are placed on journalists, the restrictions that are placed on Muslim civil society figures. It's egregious, and it's getting worse. And unfortunately, it doesn't get a lot of attention, except for people who are already South Asia watchers. It doesn't get a lot of attention in the English press or the Western press in general. But of course, the human rights violations that are occurring in India, either at the behest of the BJP, or the BJP and the Indian government is turning a blind eye to it. Yeah. You know, both, but in some cases actively participating in it. You have state actors, you have incidents where police are encouraging communal violence, yeah, or directly engaging in communal violence. So yes, these are terrible things, and I think they deserve more attention. Of course, the issue, some of the things that the Indian government and Indian military was doing in Kashmir did get some attention over the last few years. There were major articles in the New York Times, yeah, and in other major outlets. And I think that's due to the fact that things became so egregious that the foreign press couldn't ignore it anymore. But I don't think that's going to shape the way the United States approaches India. And I'm not sure how much influence the United States could have on India to alter the way it approaches human rights. But at the end of the day, I think what's going to govern that relationship are the strategic interests involved. And of course, I'll be the first to say that the United States can be hypocritical when it comes to human rights, and we're very good at documenting human rights violations, and we have administrative bodies that do that related to religious minority rights throughout the world and so forth, and things like that. But we will call it out with one country, such as Iran, and we'll turn a blind eye when it comes to another country.
Okay. There's just one question, then you can.
Okay.
You're right. Probably these human rights issues will not affect U.S.-India relations or India's relations with other European countries. We understand that sitting here, and we hope that people of Pakistan and people elsewhere also, normal people, ordinary people, understand that human rights is not an issue which determines international relations. Morality is not an issue which determines interstate relations. It's more of what's really in the interest of the countries. But Adam, what role does the US envisage for India within the region? How can India be an ally, real ally, or what would you expect a real ally like India to do for you, the Americans, in South Asian region?
Well, for one thing, I'd say that it's not even interest that dictate, it's perceived interest that dictate. Okay. I'd actually argue that countries routinely get their objective interests wrong. I mean, I'll use the United States as an example. I think we got our objective interests in Afghanistan wrong for 20 years, but we had perceived interests, and we spent a lot of blood and treasure in pursuit of those perceived interests. Now we have a perceived interest in containing China. I've already said I think it's a flawed ambition because I don't think it's possible. I think a much healthier approach would be to have healthy competition, but also vigorous diplomacy, rather than this fantasy that we can truly contain China. But given that the perceived interest in Washington is that we should contain China, I think we see India as being a key partner in that due to its location in terms of the Indian Ocean and so forth, and due to its size and due to the fact it's a nuclear power.
What about the capability?
Well, I don't know if we know what the capability is. I think the capability of the Indian military is probably not. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I think the capability of the Indian military is probably not up to par of what the U.S. would like.
So you will keep on propping up India militarily?
well, I'm not sure the United States is propping up the Indian military, but I think the United States is going to assist the development of the Indian military in areas that
Isn't it the same thing?
I think propping up is much more
Okay.
substantial than helping. I mean, are we propping up the Pakistani military? No, but we've given the Pakistani military key technologies that have helped it increase its own capability. But again, and I think this is an important point. I actually think you're asking me the wrong question. You're asking me what role does the United States envisage for India? I think the more relevant question is what role does India envisage for India? I mean, like it or not, India is a massive country in South Asia. India is going to be the most important country in South Asia, and I say this knowing full well that Pakistan is a very important country. But if you weigh India against Pakistan for the United States, of course, India is going to be more important. And but I don't think that's the right way to look at it necessarily. I think India and Pakistan are important in different ways. But what happens in Islamabad is that we're routinely asked, if you're an American, and just to be clear, I don't represent the US government, but if you're an American, and I'm sure this is true for the US government as well, you're routinely asked, okay, why does the United States choose India? Well, the United States isn't choosing India. The United States is choosing India for the Indo-Pacific strategy, but there's still a whole plethora of other areas where the United States can choose Pakistan. And these don't have to be mutually exclusive. But the reality is that the United States is going to be less important in this region than the regional actors themselves. And ultimately, it's going to be up to India and Pakistan to decide who they are going to be in the region.
Okay. Yes. Adam, you mentioned, human rights violations, minorities, dealing within India as well as in Kashmir side. I know you are not perhaps expert in that, but we would appreciate your views in that. Do you see any US good offices, I'm not asking mediation, good offices in promoting bilateral dialogue between Pakistan and India to resolve this issue, talk to each other? There are so many irritants, so that in order to have some, peaceful environment in South Asia.
Well, so of course, President Trump famously said that he would mediate in the Kashmir dispute. Yeah. Of course, President Trump said many things that he didn't mean. That, in my view, was an empty statement because India would reject it outright. Okay. So it was very easy for him to simply, whether he even knew what he was saying or not, I think is up for dispute. But let's just give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he understood what it meant to mediate that conflict. It was still an empty statement because India would reject that. So of course there's not a role for, I don't think the US wants to mediate on Kashmir, and even if the United States did want to mediate on Kashmir, India would reject that outright. But I do think it's in the interest of the United States for there to be dialogue between India and Pakistan, and the United States can encourage that and it should encourage it. We forget that up until the conflict in Ukraine, the part of the world where it was perhaps most likely that there could be a nuclear conflict was South Asia. Yeah. And that would be devastating for the world, devastating for US security, certainly. And I think one reason, I hope this is understood in Pakistan, I think it is, one reason that the United States has always been so focused on some of the anti-India terrorist groups is fear that this could spark a nuclear conflict. It wasn't really about singling out Pakistan. I understand why some Pakistanis felt singled out, but I don't think that was ever the intent. I think the intent was, if one of these groups conducts a heinous enough of an attack in India, and it triggers a conventional war, as we've seen it does in the past, I think that the fear is that could raise the stakes and there could be a nuclear conflict.
All right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Weinstein is here for a couple of weeks. This is our first program with him. We have held a series of programs on various issues, keeping in view his expertise. Thank you for watching this episode. We'll be back again.